All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week 7. This week we're going to focus on the jihadist threat to America. As with the 2 prior weeks, it's important to clarify who we're discussing. So certainly this discussion does not include mainstream Muslims. This discussion is only focusing on those that are extremists and willing to commit acts of violence in support of their religion. There are 4 readings this week. A lot of information in these articles. I'm not going to be able to cover all the information in all the articles in this video. Gosh, it would be probably a couple-hour video to try to do that. So I'm going to talk about 2 of them mainly, and then leave the other 2 to y'all. So if you look at the dates in these articles, admittedly some of the information in these articles is a bit dated. For example, the Bergen article mentions that Osama bin Laden is still alive, which obviously he is not. But there's important pieces in these articles that still hold true today. So the first article we're going to discuss is Vedino. This article does a historical perspective on jihadist terrorism in America. So even though the historical aspects of this is important, for the sake of time, I'm not going to discuss the first part of the article, because it's simply a narrative about the history of jihadist terrorism. But be sure to read it, read the entire article, because the historical aspects are important to kind of understanding current times. So I'm going to begin my discussion with the section entitled Delayed Awareness. Well, the United States didn't really discuss or acknowledge homegrown jihadist threat until probably the mid-2000s. Prior to this, focus was almost exclusively on the jihadist threat from overseas. But then after the series of attacks in London in 2005, the U.S. really started to look more closely at the threat, from within, this kind of homegrown jihadist threat. Because after those attacks in London happened, the U.S. started to wonder, are these same radicalization patterns, that are happening in Europe, are those things happening here, or could they happen here if they're not? And it's really an interesting thing to consider because radicalization, even today, the levels of radicalization in Europe and the United States are different. So Vedino kind of identifies 4 reasons why it's occurring. The first is that American Muslims are generally speaking significantly better off economically than Muslims in Europe. The average Muslim American's household income is pretty much equal to that of an average American. Now, while this doesn't always keep people from becoming radicalized, there's no doubt that people who feel disenfranchised, may be more likely to radicalize than someone that doesn't feel disenfranchised. So as a result of the improved economics of American Muslims, is that there's not really many areas where poor Muslims are concentrated, like there is in Europe. And in those places in Europe, radical Islam is spread throughout this kind of, it's almost like an ideological sanctuary where, it's kind of the only game in town, so to speak, in Europe. Now, it's not entirely true that those places don't exist in America. There's been recent reporting about the Somali community in Minneapolis and how it served as a pretty fertile recruiting ground for jihadists. More men and boys from this community in Minneapolis has joined or has attempted to join foreign terrorist organizations than any other place in America. But kind of overall, the occurrence of these types of places occurs much less frequently here than it does in Europe. Also in the United States' favor is the geographic dispersion, immigration patterns, and then tougher immigration policies that have prevented extensive recruiting and propaganda networks to establish themselves in America. Another reason is that large segments of the American Muslim population belong to ethnicities that have traditionally followed a more moderate interpretations of Islam and generally speaking have been less susceptible to radicalization. Now, obviously, none of those things are guarantees, right? None of those characteristics will guarantee that radicalization will not happen, because obviously it is in some places. Factors such as perceptions of discrimination, frustration with U.S. foreign policy can both lead to radicalization. There's evidence of this increasing alienation in recent generations of Muslim men that could also lead to increased radicalization. And then there's this thought about geographic isolation. And prior to the internet and social media, groups being isolated from each other geographically, especially in a place as big as the United States, right? Because it's way bigger than England or all those countries in Europe. They're not very big, right? The United States is quite a bit bigger, so there was a lot of geographic isolation, which kind of prevented these networks from forming. But access to the internet, social media, those things have all kind of bridged those gaps where people, regardless of where they're at in the United States now, can connect with other radicals around the globe at any time. So what do you do about it, right? What are the solutions to homegrown jihadists? Well, solutions are hard to develop because groups are hard to detect. So sometimes tactics like arresting suspected possible terrorists for immigration or other non-terrorism offenses becomes a tactic. Using undercover officers to infiltrate suspected groups, to try to expose them before they commit a violent offense is a tactic. The key is always trying to find these groups or people that are prone to terrorism prior to them committing acts of terror. So that's always the challenge, and developing solutions to that is increasingly difficult. All right, so I'm going to move on now to Bergen. Like I said, this article is a bit dated, but I wanted to start with the information starting on page 76, trends in the changing threat environment. So one of the first kind of trend that's still occurring is that a large number of Americans are attaching themselves to terrorist groups or Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. And somewhat related to that is that jihadists are no longer fitting this profile that was used for years to determine people that were at risk for radicalization. As we mentioned in the Vedino article, things like poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity, those were all commonly believed to lead to radicalization, and then leading people to commit terrorist acts. And again, while those can certainly be precursors to involvement in terror, they're not, I don't want to say widely accepted, but they're not as set in stone. They're not surefire, sure things anymore. Because there's more and more evidence that more highly educated people from more economically stable backgrounds, such as much more middle class, they're becoming more involved in terror groups and leaving the United States to go join terrorist groups. And also part of this profile, we talk about, poverty and socioeconomic stuff, but also ethnically, there's a wide range of ethnicities now that are radicalizing and becoming involved in jihadist activities. So there's really no kind of ethnic profile either anymore. And, the United States, we call ourselves the melting pot. And the United States for a long time believed with this tradition of being a melting pot where, people come here and everyone assimilates, and becomes part of the American culture. America believed for a long time that would protect us from radicalization, but it's not happening like it was. There's warmer groups that feel disenfranchised or don't feel that they're actually part of America, even though they're here. So all those things are kind of leading to where the threat environment is changing. So this not fitting a particular profile, that works really nicely into Al-Qaeda's strategy of diversification. Al-Qaeda's never believed that they could beat the United States militarily. Like they never thought they'd go toe-to-toe with the U.S. And militarily defeat us. So what they try to do is they attempt to drain the U.S. both emotionally and financially by using a wide variety of attacks by people of various ethnicities and backgrounds to where at some point they think the United States is going to feel overwhelmed and just lose interest, kind of just throw your hands up, be like, we're just tired of dealing with this. So that's kind of been their strategy. Now they have, obviously 9/11 was a big time attack, but their strategy all along is to be kind of just nit and pick at the U.S. And more or less just kind of drive us crazy. It's kind of what their strategy was. So while Al Qaeda has been weakened since 9/11, they certainly have not gone away. One of their strengths identified in the article is that they have influence over other groups, and they still do. Worldwide, Al Qaeda still is pretty influential. They can get other groups to do, what they want. One of their other strengths is that, the article says their top leadership's intact, but obviously it's not anymore. But similar to that is that, Al Qaeda is kind of set up kind of like a drug cartel, where even though top leaders keep getting killed and arrested, there's always people waiting in the wings ready to just step up, and take their turn in a leadership role. So it's not like, before bin Laden, was killed, kind of the thinking was, well, if we take out bin Laden, obviously Al Qaeda will then die. You cut the head off, right, and the body dies. But that's not what happened, because they have this, kind of leadership set up to where it's just next man up, right? Somebody gets arrested or killed, and then somebody else just, steps right in. And then another strength is that they get a lot of media coverage, no matter what they do, right? Failed plot, lots of media coverage. Completed plot, lots of media coverage. Okay, so that's one of their strengths too, is they know how to, play at the media. If you remember when bin Laden was alive, he was releasing videos all the time, and they would be on the U.S. news, they'd be on worldwide news, right? There are these videos. Well, we don't get all the videos as much anymore. But still, there is kind of outsized media coverage anytime Al Qaeda or some other group does something. All right, so for the sake of time, I'm going to stop with Bergen there. Make sure you read the remainder of the article. Look at the strategic calculations and potential future threats. So that leaves us with two articles, Spage and Brooks. So Spage focuses on lone wolf terrorism. And one of his main points that he highlights is that, what's the definition of lone wolf terrorism? Well, it varies, right? It varies just as much as definitions of general terrorism. So depending on how you define it, depends on how you look at it, depends on how it's addressed. So that's something he covers in his article. What are the policy implications of that? So when you're reading his analysis, you'll notice that he doesn't just focus on jihadist terrorism, but encompasses a wide variety of ideologies when he's looking at these lone wolf incidents. So he looks at a variety of different characteristics of lone wolves and also some at the radicalization process. All right, so be sure to read that article carefully and then think about the various issues he raises. And then the final article this week is Brooks. And Brooks examines the threat of homegrown terrorism, and then discusses how serious the threat it is. And it's a little bit different perspective than a lot of the stuff that you'll read. So it's really an interesting article, and make sure you read it. Okay, with that, I'm going to end for today. As always, if you have questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. And I'll see you next week.